Welcome back to my channel where I talk about the strange and unusual, and today I have an amazing true crime story. And if you love true crime, perfect. Or if you just want to escape the mind-numbing boredom that is quarantine, also welcome. I'm going to be talking about Charles Ning and Leonard Lake today, and their story is so interesting because they're a serial killer pair, which is so wild. I mean, it's hard enough to find a friend that you can agree with on things, much less a person you agree to torture and kill tons of people with. And they did this for 2 whole years up in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Northern California. And they could have gone on torturing and killing people for a lot longer, who knows how long. But they made one mistake on June 2nd, 1985. It was because they had broken a vice, I don't know tools, but it was something they were using to torture people with. So of course they couldn't leave that broken. So they went to a hardware store in San Francisco. But Charles Ning had a tendency to steal and shoplift, and he tried to do that today with the tool. And as he was taking out, the store owner noticed, called him out, called the police, and Ning took off. He was gone, but Leonard Lake attempted to pay for it after the fact, but the police had already arrived and they began questioning him and noticed some inconsistencies with his story. Mainly that his ID said his name was Robin Stapley, who was 26 years old, and the man they had in front of them was a lot older than that. So they grew suspicious. They looked in his car and found a .22 revolver with a silencer on it, which is illegal. So they had a reason to arrest him. They took him into custody, and Leonard Lake knew that if they looked even a little further into his life, everything would come crumbling down. They would find out what he had been doing, and he would never get out of custody. But he had planned for a moment just like this. He asked for a glass of water from the police. They gave it to him, and he secretly took out a cyanide pill he had sewn into his clothing. He swallowed that, and when police came back into the interrogation room, they found him unconscious on the ground. They rushed him to the hospital, but he was already in a coma. He wasn't going to tell them anything. And 4 days later, he died. But Leonard Lake's death was only the beginning of the nightmare for police, because they figured that you wouldn't have a cyanide pill sewn into your clothing and take it just for shoplifting. That's a bit of an overreaction. So they knew they were into something bad, and it was just the beginning. And what they did is fingerprinted him at the hospital. So by now they knew his true identity. So they knew he wasn't Robin Stapley, whose identity he had been using. So who was Robin Stapley? When they looked, he had been reported missing for several weeks. And the car Leonard Lake had been driving, although the license plate was registered to Leonard Lake, the car wasn't his, it was Paul Costner's, who was a car salesman from San Francisco, who took a man matching Leonard Lake's description on a test drive on November 5th, 1984, and was never seen from again. And most importantly, all of this led police to discovering Leonard Lake's cabin in the woods. But Leonard Lake's perversion started a long time before the cabin in the woods. When he was just 6 years old, his parents separated and he moved in with his maternal grandmother. And it's alleged that she encouraged him to take nude photos of his sisters, and that's what got him into this obsession with pornography. And he also apparently extorted sexual acts from his sisters. And that's disturbing enough, but he didn't limit his perversions to people. He also would torture animals. He would collect up mice and kill them, mutilate their bodies, and then dissolve them in acid. Lake did 2 tours in Vietnam before being medically discharged because he had a mental breakdown during war and was diagnosed with impending schizophrenia. And he returned to the US after his discharge and seemed to be adjusting pretty well. He returned to San Jose, California, attempted to go to college but dropped out after a semester, and he even met a woman and married her in 1975. But that didn't last long because she found out he was making and starring in amateur BDSM porn with other women. So that was a pretty good sign of why to leave him. She wasn't cool with that. And it turns out, though, he was pretty open with talking about bondage to pretty much anybody who would listen. But that didn't turn off everybody, and in 1981, he met Clara Lynn Balaz, who would become his second wife, and she played into his fantasies. She even starred in some pornographic films he made, and together they moved to the Greenfield Ranch, which was a large communal settlement up in Northern California, which has a much more laid-back lifestyle, and wife swapping there wouldn't have been abnormal. So it seemed like a better place for Lake, except he had very extremist views. He was a survivalist, and he believed that the world was going to end in nuclear war, that all life would be wiped out, and that he had to prepare for this. He had to stockpile weapons and create a bunker. And he started to do that on the ranch, but the owner said no. And so that's when his focus changed to a cabin that his wife's parents owned, and it was a lot more remote, and there is where he started to build his dungeon. And eventually him and his wife would get divorced, but he continued to use that cabin and the property it was on. And in 1981 he met Charles Ning, which is where this partnership began, and they realized they had a lot in common. And partially that was because Charles Ning was raised in an eerily similar way. Ning was born in British Hong Kong to wealthy parents, although his father was abusive, and Ning was constantly in trouble. He got expelled from multiple schools, and he had a penchant for stealing things, which would be a reoccurring problem for him throughout his life. And in 1978, he got a student visa and came to California, but just like Blake, he only lasted one semester in college. And then he was in a hit and run accident, and to escape prosecution for that, he joined the Marines. But he only lasted there for a year before he stole weapons, and they were going to place him in custody, but he escaped and went back to Northern California in 1980, which is where he met up with Lake. But by 1982, federal authorities raided the mobile home the two men were sharing together, and they found explosives and illegal weapons. And Lake was put out on bond, but he jumped bail and then began using aliases and moving around the state. And Ning was returned to the Marines, and he pled guilty to the desertion and the theft, and he served 18 months before being paroled and dishonorably discharged in 1984, and he immediately went back to Leonard Lake, and they moved into the cabin together. The first confirmed murder was in May of 1983, and that was Charles Gunner, who was Lake's best man at his second wedding. And he was, reportedly a good friend, but that didn't stop Lake from killing him and posing as Gunner after the fact. And then in July of 1983, Lake's little brother Donald came up to the cabin, and he was never seen from again. And his death is not confirmed, but it's strongly believed he was also murdered. And they didn't have any discretion. Friends, relatives, neighbors, it didn't matter. And between 1984 and 1985, Ning and Lake killed whoever they wanted. And it was possible because they were in this remote cabin, and nobody knew who was taking these people, why these people were going missing. They didn't put it together that it was these two men doing these horrendous things. And they would kill men, women, infants. They didn't care. They would normally kill the men first, but sometimes they made the men watch as they raped their partners, and then they killed them. And they normally kept the women as sex slaves. Behind a shelf in the bunker was a hidden door that led to a 3-foot by 6-foot room where the women were kept, and it had a crude cot, one shelf, a bucket, and toilet paper. It was, horrible living conditions. Inside the room where the women were kept was a single piece of paper with rules they were supposed to follow, and these men treated these women so terribly. They were continuously tortured and raped. Some of them were put in leg irons as they were assaulted, and some were assaulted so severely they didn't survive. And some were just allowed to slowly die of their injuries, while others were killed once the men got bored of them. On the property, police found 12 shallow graves, and in them was the first family, which was Lonnie Bond and Brenda O'Connor and their infant son, who just happened to be Lake's closest neighbors. And Brenda always had a bad feeling about Lake. She even one time said that she saw him burying a body and she wanted to call police, but her husband talked her out of it, and instead he invited over Robin Stapley for added protection. And if you remember, that is the man's ID who Lake was carrying. And then the second family was Harvey and Deborah Dubbs and their infant son. And they had put an ad in the San Francisco newspaper that was trying to rent their videotape equipment, and they were also never seen again. And then the other bodies on the property were of men that had been robbed and killed. And this included Robin Stapley and Paul Costner, whose ID and car Lake had been using. The other men were Randy Johnson and Michael Carroll. And Carroll had shared a cell with Ning in prison. And the other body was of Kathleen Allen, who was only 18 years old and was Michael Carroll's girlfriend. And later they would also find Charles Gunner's body, who was Lake's friend, and Lake's little brother's has never been found. Police also found a handwritten treasure map, which led them to two 5-gallon buckets that were buried on the property. Inside the first was a bunch of people's ID and personal effects, which suggests that numerous people never made it off the property. And in the second one was a journal that was written by Lake, which detailed the torture he and Ning inflicted on his victims. And also he wrote about Operation Miranda, which was his plan to survive the nuclear war that he thought was approaching. And it was how he was going to survive in his bunker and repopulate the world with his female sex slaves. And inside the bunker, they also found pictures, including 21 photos of women who were in different states of undress. And at the time, they had no idea if these women were alive. They also found videotapes documenting the rape and torture of Brenda O'Connor, Deborah Dubbs, and Kathy Allen. And one of the videos showed Deborah Dubbs being assaulted so severely that she couldn't have survived it. And another, Ning is taunting O'Connor, and he can be heard saying, "You can cry and stuff like the rest of them, but it won't do you no good. We're pretty cold-hearted, so to speak." And finding this cabin of horrors created a media frenzy, and the police actually allowed the media onto the property while they were still discovering evidence and uncovering new bodies. And they did this in the hopes of identifying these victims. And I've read conflicting things, but I believe that the 21 girls in the photo were actually identified and that they were alive thanks to the media. And also the police created a task force and set up a phone hotline in the hopes of identifying these victims. And that's how a lot of these victims were identified, is by people coming forward and also police tracking down missing people who had come into contact with both of these men. And they were also searching for Ning, who at this point was a fugitive, and he ended up being captured in Canada because, once again, he couldn't resist shoplifting. And as he was trying to steal, a security guard caught on to him, and they started to struggle. Ning shot him, non-fatally though, and Ning was able to be subdued at that point, brought into custody, and charged with possession of a firearm, assault, and shoplifting. And he got 4.5 years in Canada. And that complicated things because not only did he have to wait that amount of time in Canada, he also had to be extradited back to the United States. And so Ning took that time that he was in jail to learn about American law, because he knew once he was back in the United States, he would be facing murder charges and potentially the death penalty. And so he was eventually extradited back in 1991 and faced 12 counts of first-degree murder. And his trial was initially set for 1993, but Ning did everything in his power to create chaos and delay the trial until it racked up huge amounts of costs for the courts. He filed motions for everything, that the food was bad, that he was being mistreated. He went through 10 lawyers, and he would get rid of one, and then sometimes they would come back and have to represent him again, and he just did everything in his power to delay this from happening. And they even had to move the trial to Orange County, and Orange County was already bankrupt at this time, but they had so much pretrial publicity that they couldn't get a fair jury for him there, and so he had to move. He also had to be kept in a special cage because so many people wanted to kill him. It was just a crazy time. He also filed malpractice suits against his lawyers, and at one point claimed he lost all trust and confidence in his lawyers so that he could file a motion to represent himself, which delayed the trial another year so that he could learn the law, but then he dismissed that notion. And in total, at the time, this case was the most expensive in the state's history. It cost $20 million. And his trial finally began in October of 1998. And you would think this would be an open and shut case because of the overwhelming amount of evidence, but actually a lot of it was circumstantial. And so they had the problem of tying Ning, and not Leonard Lake, who was already dead, into the crimes itself. And the main two things they had against him were the evidence of a dead man and a criminal, because they had Leonard Lake's journals and the videos documenting the torture, and they also had Maurice Leber's testimony, and he was a prisoner alongside Ning in Canada, and he was going to be the prosecution's key witness because he had detailed evidence of the crime as well as Ning's drawings, which he had creepily given to him, and that were like documenting the crimes in a weird cartoonish way. But before the trial even began, he died in a car crash. And despite what was in the videos and the journals, Ning maintained that he only observed what happened. He wasn't an active participant. And he did admit that he helped move the bodies of Bond and Stapley, but other than that, he said that Lake was the mastermind behind all the kidnapping, the rapes, the tortures, the murders, and it was kind of an easy scapegoat. Lake was dead. He couldn't defend himself and tell us what participation Ning did, and that's the way the defense painted it, that Leonard Lake was this deviant, dark man who had these perversions, and he was a mastermind, where Ning was just subservient. And they even had people come and testify to Lake's character. It's not that hard to imagine that he was a bad person. I mean, he's caught on camera saying all he really wants of a woman is for her to be a female slave.
To explain, what I want is an off-the-shelf sex partner. I want to be able to use a woman whenever and however I want. And when I'm tired or bored or not interested, I simply want to put her away, lock her up in a little room, get her out of my sight, out of my life. Slave, there's no way around it. Primarily a sexual slave, but nonetheless a physical slave as well. I believe that if I can construct a holding cell, a place where I can put such a woman, a facility that is so stark, so empty, so cold, so quiet, so totally removed from the world, that I can quickly condition a young woman to cooperate with me fully.
So that's not a hard picture to paint, but the videos and the journals don't really make Ning look out to be this unwilling participant, and the prosecution says that him and Lake willingly participated together in this partnership. And Lake's ex-wife, Clairlyn Balaz, got full immunity when she cooperated with investigators, and when she was on the stand, instead of asking her questions, Ning's lawyer just read aloud parts of her immunity. So it was to imply that she, rather than Ning, had involvement with the crimes, but she got immunity for it. And they also included in the trial the written testimony of Maurice Leberge, who had died, and it included details of the crime that he wouldn't have known about unless Ning told him. So the prosecution's strategy was to give overwhelming circumstantial evidence against Ning, and it worked. On February 11th, 1999, Ning was found guilty of 11 counts of murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection, but he remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison because California hasn't executed an inmate since 2006. And that is the insane story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ning. And if you would like to hear more stories like that, please subscribe.